into the Psych with Mike Library. This is Dr. Michael Mahan, and I am here as always with Mr. Brett Newcomb.
How you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing absolutely great.
So we had talked last week about the biology of sex and the reason for sex in relationships. We got to the end of that, and you said that there were some things that we had been talking about there that you didn't want to leave hanging in the air. The last thing that we had been talking about was Sternberg's triadic theory of love. So tell me what about that you were feeling like we wanted to revisit.
Well, I think in any discussion of sex and relationships, you have to have included communication, fantasy, religion and morality. Mm-hmm. And what lessons were you taught about sex as a child growing up in a culture that has so many confusing messages about sex? Mm-hmm. I mean, for instance, I used to teach high school, and I was concerned about the messages that high school age kids were getting from their families about being sexually active versus what they were getting from going to movies and advertisements that they would see on the radio or the television or at the movies about sex, which were contradictory and challenging messages. Mm-hmm. So if we tell our kids don't have sex outside of marriage, don't have sex at all unless you are really intimately involved with someone and committed to them, but all of our messaging that comes through the media of our culture is about lust and arousal and gratification and non-relational, non-intimate sex, then those kids get confused. Mm-hmm. And you know, what are they supposed to do and when? And then you have the whole message of guilt and shame if you've done something that felt like it was a good idea at the time, but later you know that you would receive a program from others if they knew that you had done that.
Mm-hmm. So we then carry those messages into our adolescent years. Mm-hmm. That's going to color or influence the people that we're attracted to or our own individual ability to be open to another person, or both?
Both, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
I think there are issues around behaviors, for instance, masturbation. Mm-hmm. I've had a number of conversations with male and female clients about whether or not masturbation was a sin, whether it was helpful, whether it was appropriate, whether it could reduce some tension in the relationship. Especially if the female was anorgasmic, if she was not able to have an orgasm for whatever reason. And that can be biological, it can be testosterone amounts that are too low, it can be psychological, having an abuse history can impact women that way. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we would discuss is, is this something that you can do? Is this something that would help you if you did do? An awful lot of people would just absolutely resist it because they had been taught morally it was unacceptable. That the only possible acceptable sexual behavior was in an intimate and committed relationship.
Right.
And then also talk to people about fantasies in relationships. If you have a sexualized relationship with someone, I think communication about what you like, what you want, what you desire, what you might like to experiment with is a critical ingredient for the successful outcome of the relationship.
Right. I also think that we grow up with this either innate or maybe it's acculturated belief that these kinds of questions answer themselves. Like you're just going to get into a relationship and you'll just know how to do it right. Exactly. and it'll be great and it'll be amazing and you won't be able to believe how great it is. Right. And that's just not true.
Yeah, I think it's really important in a committed sexualized relationship to pay attention to what your partner wants and likes, and certainly watching them, being aware of them is a critical component of that. But I think talking to them and asking.
I was just going to say, but more than what I tell people all the time is, yes, you can watch them, you can be aware of them. That's great. I want people to try and be aware of each other. That helps you to practice empathy, but you also have the right, and I would argue the responsibility, to tell your significant other what you like and what you don't like.
Right.
And people feel very constrained. I mean,
I think you have the same level of responsibility to ask them what they like.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I know that you've had this experience as well, but the first time, because I will insist on bringing up sex in any time that I'm usually seeing anybody who's above the age of, 16 or 17,
Right.
but certainly anytime I'm seeing a couple together, I will always make sure that I say something about that, because I want to normalize the conversation about that, because they're a lot of times couples won't bring that up in the context of the therapeutic relationship.
They won't at all. Yeah, they don't like. It's awkward, and they don't want to talk about it.
Right. And so, and yet that there are issues that revolve around that.
Yeah.
And so I bring it up, and we'll drop that hint several times, and then they'll start talking about it, but they won't bring it up themselves.
And I think it's very important to talk to couples about their cueing strategies and behaviors. What do you do to signal I'm interested in having sex, or I'm interested in having this kind of sex, or this sexual behavior? How do you communicate that if you're interested in it?
Right. And, I'm on LinkedIn. You're probably on LinkedIn. And so I have this network of more than 1,000 people that I'm connected to. I don't know any of them, or I only know a handful of them.
Yeah.
But, that's just the way that those kind of social media things go. And so many, not so many, but there are dozens of those individuals that are sex therapists. Okay. And it is amazing to me the number, like, I have not seen on LinkedIn one older male who's a sex therapist. They tend to be younger, very attractive females. And that's like, if I'm going to go talk about sex, I'm going to go and I'm going to talk to this designated sexual therapist. And I understand the psychology of that. But I don't think that is necessarily the greatest level of expertise.
So you are saying you think that their willingness to talk to a hot young thing would be more accessible than their willingness to talk to an ugly old thing like you or me?
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm not, but I'm not sure that necessarily means now. And I don't mean to disparage anybody who is a sexual therapist. That's fine with me. I don't mind that as something that you market.
A good segue for this conversation, because a lot of what we want to do is talk to therapists out there. And I taught therapists how to be therapists for 35 years at a couple different universities, and I know you are still doing that. And one of the conversations that we often have in the classroom is, how do you discuss these things without having any unanticipated negative experiences? And my response is, you should always anticipate negative experiences and misunderstandings. But one of the ways that you have to learn to function is you have to recognize, is there sexualized energy present in the conversation? And if there is, you have to confront it. You have to say, that's not what this is about. Nobody's getting off on this conversation, not you, not me. So we can discuss it and we can talk about it, but we can't feel those feelings without getting distorted or distracted. So if I feel that it's in the room, then I have to say, is that coming from me? Am I getting turned on by this conversation? And if it's not, is it coming from this other person? And if I can't determine it, then I have to have that discussion with them to say, do you feel it? Are you aware of it? And often that'll shut it down just by asking that question. But it's a incredibly dangerous thing to allow. So you have to fight it.
Well, and one of the things that I try and be aware of when I'm doing this work especially with one individual. So if one individual comes and wants to talk about either their sexual dysfunction or their sexual dissatisfaction with the relationship, I'm always wondering, okay, why is this person coming in isolation? Now, sometimes that's legitimate. Sometimes there are reasons why a person would come in isolation, but I would always prefer to have that conversation in the context of the unified couple, if there is a way to be able to do that. Right. If there's a reason why that isn't doable, then obviously I'm not going to force someone to do something that would be not therapeutic or would be destructive.
Well, but it's also possible, because you're human, that you have issues that maybe you are not aware of yet, and you start to feel those sexualized feelings. It's inappropriate to discuss that with your client. I'm sexually attracted to you. I want you. But that means you have to go to supervision. You have to go talk that over with whoever is supporting you clinically to help you keep your hands clean.
Well, I want to do that because I'm worried about what the transference is, not what the countertransference is. So the transference is what the client's experience
Projecting
of
on
the therapist
you.
is. The countertransference is the therapist's experience of the client and the relationship. But I'm worried about if you're coming by yourself and you're wanting to talk about these things, is that because there's a real reason, like there's not safety in doing that in the context of the unified couple, or is it because they are seeking the fantasy themselves? And if they are, then I want to downplay that and encourage, well, what if you brought your partner in and we had this conversation? Because the truth is, if you're going to get what you want in your sexual relationship, you're only going to get that if your partner is on board with it.
I agree. And so you suggest to them that even if they're nibbling at uncovering and focusing it in their own minds, this is where I am, this is what I want.
Right.
At some point, they still have to put it on the table in the
Yeah.
relationship to say to the other partner, this is who I am, this is what I want.
Exactly.
Do you still love me, and would you do these things with me freely and of your own free will to participate? Or will you resent it and be angry about it or embarrassed by it? And is there a way we can work through that? And I think it has to be worked through both conversationally and behaviorally.
And one of the primary tools that I use when I'm talking to couples, or really even just in general, is Gary Chapman's book, The 5 Languages of Love.
Yeah.
And the reason is not because, I mean, the book is fine, but not because it's, the only thing out there, but because it's a really simple, easy to digest. So the 5 languages of love are physical touch, words of affirmation, acts of service, time together, and gifts. And it's ubiquitous enough that you can get lots of information about it easily on the internet. You can get all kinds of pseudo quizzes to be able to identify your love language. But the goal of the exercise is not to understand what your love language is, but to understand the love language of your partner. And this is the reason, because if I speak Japanese and you speak English, it doesn't matter how many times that I scream "I love you" to you, you can't understand it because it's a different language. And so if we speak different love languages, it doesn't matter how many times I do the dishes if your love language is words of affirmation.
Yes, absolutely agree with all of that. I would say in the area of gifts, we're not talking about, I don't think Chapman is talking about buying things for people. I mean, a gift can be an act of service.
Sure.
It can be, I'm going to give you the gift of cooking every meal for the next 2 weeks because I want you to know that I care about you. It could be I'm going to buy you a new rug,
Right.
Or I'm going to buy you a new ring, but that often gets misperceived by people in terms of what physical thing have you given me that has monetary value that
Right.
shows me how much you love me.
Right. And I think the difference between gifts and acts of service is, I mean, like, if you're going to do acts of service, like I do all of the laundry in the relationship between my wife and my family, and always have done that. And so I'm going to do that all the time. So there's consistency in that acts of service thing. Gifts might be something that would be temporary. Like I'm going to do the dishes for a month to take that off of your plate because you're having a really hard time at work.
Or I'm going to invite your mother over for dinner.
Sure. Right. Exactly. Absolutely. Which is not something that I enjoy doing, but I'm going to do that for you because I love you.
Right.
And so understanding what your partner's love language is, then if you are going to take the effort to understand that, then what you have to do, it's your responsibility then to start communicating to your partner in their love language.
Exactly.
And then their job is to start to communicate to you in your love language.
Yeah.
And if you are taking the time to be able to communicate to each other in your own love language, then you're going to have a really, really strong relationship.
Well, and you have to learn that the reciprocity isn't required to be on the same channel. If I use words of affirmation to say I love you, and you do gifts of service to say you love me, I have to understand that those are equivalent messages.
Right.
And that's part of what we try to teach people to understand,
Right.
so that they can have that dialogue or understanding when they try to work out problems.
But if it's in your native love language, then you're going to be more likely to understand that than because for a long time. So my love language is probably more physical touch, but I'm a real big believer in acts of service, and so I would do a lot of stuff around the house. And my wife's love language is clearly words of affirmation. And, I would be thinking, well, why don't you understand how much I love you? And she's like, well, you never tell me you love me. And I'm like, I tell you I love you all the time. Look at everything I do. And she's like, I don't care about that.
Right.
I'm like, how do you not care about that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a challenge. And then, so let's segue this conversation back to sex and intimacy.
Okay.
Because I think that successful sexual relationships are relationships that are founded on intimacy. And for me, intimacy, I try to explain this to my clients, I understand an intimate relationship as one in which the participants take off more of their masks with each other than they do anywhere else in the world. Because I believe that we always all wear masks. It's a very difficult thing not to try to project an image that you want people to appreciate and perceive positively. When I'm with you, if I trust you not to hurt me with what you know about me or what I let you see about me. So while I may wear a public mask that's completely different from how I experience myself privately, I'm more willing to show that to you. And I think intimacy requires that and facilitates that.
So I've always said to people that intimacy requires three components. It requires trust. Well, actually, it requires honesty, trust, and empathy. So the first thing is you got to be honest, and that you have to be able to have something yourself before you can give it away. So you can't give away something that you don't have.
Okay.
So if you can't be honest with yourself, you can't be honest with another person. If you can't trust yourself, you can't be trusting another person. If you can't be intimate or have empathy for yourself, you can't have empathy for another person. So all of those things have to start from within, but then you have to give them to somebody else. And so when you talk about this whole taking the mask off thing, what I tell people is the whole trust component is like climbing a tree and climbing out onto a branch, knowing that there could be somebody behind you with a saw chopping the branch off, and being okay with that.
Yeah, that's. Everybody has a different language, and so if you find a way, part of doing therapy is learning to listen to your client well enough to learn what they can hear, and then trying to speak to them. And so whether you start with the trust or empathy as the focal point of the conversation, how well do you do that? How do you experience it? How do you define it? Eventually you get all three of those topics on the table.
Yeah. But would you agree that would be an intimate relationship, and a relationship that had honesty, trust, and empathy?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so then when you can help people to, I really believe that language is important, because it's how we think and how we construct our symbolic world. And so when you give people that language, and then they can think about, okay, this is the way in which I see trust in my relationship. This is the way I see honesty in my relationship. This is the way I see empathy in my relationship. Then they're like, okay, well, I have those things. And then it can change the way that they see the relationship.
Well, I think the issue with honesty, though, as you just stated, is you have to be honest with yourself. And I think that's a lot of what happens in therapy, is that you encourage people to listen to themselves better and find out what they're resisting, what they're objecting to, because they have to know. And the challenge in an intimate relationship is to say, this is honestly who I am. And the real question then is, do you still
Can you
want
accept
me,
right.
if this is who I am? And that has to be reciprocal. So I think that's a key part.
And be able to understand that perception is reality. So you may perceive that this is your honesty and your truth. The other person may then say, I see it differently. Like, I could tell you that I'm being completely honest and faithful with you, and then you could say to me, yeah, but I see you having your phone in front of you when we're laying in bed,
right?
And I don't know what you're doing. And so then that causes me to feel insecure. So you could feel like you're being very, very honest. I could feel like that you aren't.
Right.
And we have to then talk about what that means. Are there different rules around what time? One of the things that I really, really, really strive to encourage people to consider is no electronics in the bedroom.
Yeah. Well, I think that intimacy, that therapy is an artificial intimacy. It's artificial in that it's meant to meet the needs of one person, not two. Mm-hmm. And so you create this artificial intimacy which says, I want to see you and understand you pretty accurately, and you're trying to be really honest with me, but I'm seeing some things that don't seem consistent. So can we talk about this or look at that? And try to encourage people to learn to listen to themselves and be more honest with themselves, and then take the risk of sharing what they've discovered about who they are with their partner. Mm-hmm. And take the show on the road, not in the safety of the therapy room, but out in the real relationship, which is back to why you say at that point we need both people in the room.
Yeah. And I think that when you encourage and really try and enhance the intimacy in the relationship, then the sex becomes better. It actually serves its purpose more effectively.
As a complement to the relationship,
right,
and not as a raison
d'etre.
Yeah.
And because I'm not going to lie, and this is something that I am continuing to try and work on. But for a lot of years, I believed that or gauged my sense of self-worth and value by how much sex there was in the relationship.
I think that's more of a masculine approach.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think that women could do that, but I think that it's less likely. Yeah. But when I started to think about that, and I started to think about, is that really the gauge that I want to use for the quality of my relationship or myself?
Gauge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And once I started to think in terms of that and started to really look at it, I realized that isn't the
Now, am I that shallow and narrowly focused?
Well, I'm absolutely that shallow. I know that about me. But do I want to be?
Right. Because
people can choose to change.
Right.
And choosing to change is a process. It's not an immediate goal. But that's why, I tell people all the time, if you always gauge your conclusions about tomorrow based on your experiences of yesterday, you are precluding the possibility that anybody can change.
Exactly. I hate beets. I've hated beets all my life. Every Christmas, my wife gives me some kind of beet. A jar of pickled beets, some beet dish, salad, what have you, that she hopes that I will try in order to change into something that she thinks would be good for me. So far, I have resisted because in addition to hating beets, I'm really stubborn.
Right. And so then you start to have these expectations about what Christmas is going to be like based on that.
Exactly.
And then the one year
what creative new thing is she going to come up with?
That your wife changes and doesn't do that, you're still going to be angry and resentful going into it, and yet the experience is going to be radically different.
So then you're saying if she changes, that'll change me?
No, I'm saying that people have to be willing to live in the moment and experience the moment rather than try and project expectations onto how things are going to be because of their experience of the past. But the human DNA is constructed to create expectations about tomorrow based on the experience of yesterday. That keeps us alive.
And what we both believe is that those expectations must be communicated. You got to find a way to talk about it.
Right, because that can facilitate change.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. So I think this was good. I'm glad that you said, hey, let's continue that conversation. So again, we're kind of encouraging everybody, if you enjoy the show, get us on a podcast, like the Facebook page. If you do watch the YouTube videos, then please like the videos and subscribe to the show. That really helps us out. As always, the music that appears in Psych with Mike is written, arranged, and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue. Thank you for your contribution. And if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike.